Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Second Vatican Council taught that sacred music forms a necessary or integral part of the solemn liturgy and is to be considered more holy in proportion as it is more closely connected with the liturgical action. While the Council approved of all forms of true art that have the necessary qualities and admits them into divine worship, it singled out Gregorian chant as especially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, as the Council says, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. In this interview, Jennifer Donelson-Nowicka discusses Gregorian chant and some of the best books for learning about it. Jennifer Donelson-Nowicka is an associate professor and the director of sacred music at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California, where she holds the William P. Mart Chair in Sacred Music and serves as the founding director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. She has co-edited Mystic Modern, The Music, Thought, and Legacy of Charles Trudeau, and has published articles and chapters on sacred music in various encyclopedias, journals, and academic monographs. She also hosts a podcast entitled Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, which just finished its 6th season. The books discussed in this episode are, first, Leisure, The Basis of Culture by Joseph Pieper. Second, The Musical Shape of the Liturgy by William Peter Mart. Third, The Graduale Romanum. Fourth, Medieval Music and the Art of Memory by Anna Maria Buseberger. And fifth, That All May Sing by Justine Ward. Links to these books can be found in the show notes of this episode. Finally, if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Donelson-Nowicka, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, what is Gregorian chant?
Well, we could start with a sort of musical definition, but the music always leads to prayer, and the two are intimately linked. So we could say, properly speaking, that Gregorian chant is the Church's official musical language, the official musical language of the Roman Rite. It is a style of music which is sung in unison, in Latin. It is laid out in basically 8 modes or scales. It has a theoretical harmonic system underlying it. And the text of Gregorian chant is the text of the liturgy. It is the sung liturgy itself. And in this way, it is the supreme sacred music. For us Westerners in the Roman Rite, it is the native musical language of the Roman Rite. That's not true of other rites of the Church. The Maronite Rite has its own kind of chant. You know, the Greeks have their own chant, the Russians their own. But for the Roman Rite, Gregorian chant is its native musical language. And so it being the sung Roman Rite, it has the same purpose as the sacred liturgy itself, which is firstly the glorification of God, and then secondly the sanctification of the faithful. And in this way, because it's officially appointed as a music for the Roman Rite by the Church, we can almost think of it like a sacramental, something that is officially appointed by the Church, that when we cooperate with it and we're properly disposed, it itself opens us up to receive the graces that are present in the most holy sacred mysteries that we celebrate in the sacred liturgy. Primarily in the Mass, but also in the divine office.
And why is the Latin Rite's main tradition of plain song called Gregorian chant?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And people might think that it is because the Holy Spirit came down as a dove and whispered in St. Gregory's ear, but alas, that is not exactly what happened. And we're not even really sure that Pope St. Gregory the Great had a lot to do with the formation of the chant in any way, or even the Roman Schola Cantorum. It might be that he had some role in forming an orphanage which then developed into the Roman Schola Cantorum, which was the body of Roman singers, the papal singers, that were largely responsible for the solidification of the Gregorian tradition and the fleshing out of it in the 7th century. But it's not even really clear that that's the case. So what we do know is that there was a body of melodies that was formed that had some sort of roots in the Middle East, in the origins of Christianity. Again, we don't really know too much about that. Had some sort of living tradition and how it was sung and practiced in Rome. And then in the 7th century, at some point, the Roman Schola Cantorum kind of shaped it so that you put the chant to every part of the liturgy that needed musicification, I guess if that's a word. And uh, then that body of music traveled up to the court of Pepin and Charlemagne, and then was spread throughout the entire Carolingian Empire by those court musicians that hybridized the Roman chant with the Franco-Gallican chant. And they wanted it to be adopted and loved by all who celebrated the Roman Rite. And so at some point, it gained the appellation Gregorian as a sort of mark of officialness or of authority, even though, again, Gregory the Great did not have much to do with it. You know, there's a really important chant book from around the year 1000 that has as its frontispiece a line sketch of Gregory the Great receiving some locution of a dove and dictating to a scribe. And this was viewed by many as a sort of pious tradition about how the Gregorian chant developed. But in origin, that image actually has its origin in connection to St. Gregory the Great's writings on moral theology. And it just so happened that it ended up on the front of a very important chant book. And so the kind of mythology of Gregory receiving these locutions of Gregorian chant from the Holy Spirit himself took off.
You've mentioned how it passes from Rome to Gaul and the Franks. Scholars now believe that Gregorian chant is a synthesis between Old Roman chant and Gallican chant. Which characteristics does it share with these older traditions, or which new characteristics does it take on?
Ah, you have hit upon one of the thorniest questions in all of Gregorian chant scholarship. So if you ever want to start an argument at a chant conference, you could pose that question. It's not really clear because we don't have so many things from the earliest layers of Roman chant. And the things that we call Old Roman chant presumably have their roots in that oldest layer of Roman chant before it was mixed with Franco-Gallican. But even then, it was not notated until much, much later, notated after what we think of the Gregorian chant as that hybridized chant. So you have kind of three layers: the Roman core, some hybridization process, and then the writing down of a Roman core, but hundreds of years after that Roman core was formed. So, sometimes when there are hundreds of years between the writing and the tradition, we don't really know what that evolution looked like and the solidity of those melodies looked like. If I were to make a surmise about this in basic terms, it would be that the texts are Roman, and and that's no small thing. That when you look at how the Roman chant or the Gregorian chant uses the text, it's really fitted like a libretto. It's not just like you take one version of the scripture and you plop it into some music, but it's really fitted to the liturgical context. You have, for example, the addition of the words Alleluia, or Dici Dominus, the Lord said, and then the quote, or even different rearrangements of the words from the various extant copies of scripture at that time. So the text being primarily Roman, and kind of the outlines of the melody. What seems particularly to me Franco-Gallican is things that are larger leaps that outline very strong poles, the structural nodes in the mode. In the chant. So, for example, if you think about a lot of mode one chants, maybe here's a famous one a lot of your readers might know, or your listeners might know. Ave Maria. That you have that strong re la de la, and that is a very distinctive sort of thing. That seems to be perhaps something that was more a Franco-Gallican thing. That when you look at the old Roman chant as it is notated, I often compare it to a little pile of noodles. It's very stepwise, and it very rarely makes any leaps. And in contrast, the Gregorian repertory is kind of like really chiseled in its melodic profile. And it's easier to trace, for example, the characteristics of each mode by those little melodic riffs characteristic to each of the modes. Yeah, so that's perhaps what I would say.
So it's more like a recitative than an aria.
Yeah, that might be a good way of making a contrast between the two. Yeah.
And does Gregorian chant have any similarities with the ancient tradition of the other rites of the church, or is it completely different from their ancient musical traditions?
That's again a very good question, and it's shrouded in a lot of unknowable past, simply because it was passed on as an oral tradition. Even in many senses, the text. The earliest layer of books that we have are sort of reference books. And so you'll get like the text, and it might even only be an incipit of a text. And so it's kind of like a liturgical index of moving through it. And then you maybe see some neumes notated above that text. And then eventually you get entire texts with stemless neumes, etc., as the earliest layers of the Gregorian books. But it's not really clear. I'm often hesitant to make those comparisons, and sometimes I'm a little nervous when other people do too. There's a strong, I think, inherently Catholic desire to want to ground all of our traditions in the Semitic placeness of the incarnation and the origins of the church. That's a completely Catholic way of looking at things. But oftentimes when they do that, they're making comparisons, for example, to Jewish music. But the simple fact is that if you look at the history of synagogue music, we actually don't have a lot in the earliest layers from that too. What we have of the Gregorian and Roman tradition is far earlier than most synagogue traditions in their documentation and musical layers. So what you're actually doing is comparing Gregorian chant to late medieval Jewish music, and so it's not really a great way of doing that Catholic impulse of wanting to ground things. We simply just don't know a lot about those origins.
And as you mentioned, Gregorian chant's particularly suited to the Roman liturgy. In fact, the Second Vatican Council stated that it's especially suited to the Roman liturgy. What makes it more suitable than other styles of liturgical music that we might use, such as the Anglican choral tradition, or chants we even take from Bach and the German choral tradition?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think maybe even a tighter comparison would be between two things listed by the Second Vatican Council, and that is the Gregorian chant and polyphony. And what the church says that polyphony is well suited for the liturgy, but Gregorian chant has that intimate connection that not even the polyphony does. One of the books that we'll talk about in a little bit is The Musical Shape of the Liturgy by William Mart. And one of Dr. Mart's key insights is that when Gregorian chant sets the texts of the liturgy, it illuminates not only the grammar and rhetorical style of the text at that point, but of the mystery of the Mass being celebrated at that point. For example, an introit sounds different from a gradual being the chant that comes after the first reading. At an introit, it accompanies a procession. And so the music moves at a slightly faster pace, what we might call a pneumatic style, where each syllable has sometimes one or two notes, but sometimes maybe as many as 3, 4, 5, or 6. But it's still moving. And each of the melodies of every Gregorian introit is quite distinctive, giving you a sense of like, okay, here's the flavor of the day. And this is something we only get to sing once a year or only on this particular class of feasts. And so it has a very chiseled profile, which is something that helps us enter into the particular mystery celebrated that day. Whereas a gradual is often a more formulaic melody. And it is also in a melismatic style, which means that some syllables might have 1 or 2 notes, but other syllables might have 12, 15, 20 notes. And a gradual is the only thing happening. The music doesn't accompany anything else at that point. It is the rite in and of itself, and it is designed to be contemplative. And that happens when you get a small bit of text, but spread out over very many notes. And so the way that the music itself sets the text helps us enter into what the liturgy itself is. And this is muted, for example, if you compare an introit, a Gregorian introit and gradual to an introit and a gradual by William Byrd in his Gradualia. Whereas in the Gregorian, you have 2 distinct Gregorian styles for those different parts of the Mass. For Byrd, it's more unified in style. His introit music sounds very similar to the style of the gradual music. And it's not differentiated in that way. It's differentiated, of course, in the text and even in the structure of the gradual, but it's not as finely chiseled to suit like a tailor-made glove, the text to enter into that point in the sacred liturgy. So if we go even further afield from that into things which even lose the profile of being a musical setting of the text of the liturgy itself, then we get into just talking about, is it beautiful? Sure, there are many things which are beautiful, but not every beautiful thing has a place in the sacred liturgy, and then not in such an integral sort of way. And this is what the Second Vatican Council says, that it's more holy in proportion to the greater fit that it has with the sacred liturgy. So, we want something that is the setting of the text of the liturgy itself, and that is made for the purpose of sacred music, the glorification of God and sanctification of the faithful, but also exhibits the 3 necessary qualities that were outlined by Pius X. And Vatican II makes reference to these these also as the necessary qualities, that being it's beautiful, it's holy, and it's universal. So it kind of is, should be all of those things wrapped into one package. The church admits of other things that are lacking in one or other areas, but they're not as integral to the liturgy.
You mentioned Pius X. Was that his document, Trad le Sollicitudini?
Yes.
Are there any other documents, important church documents on Gregorian chant or which touch upon Gregorian chant?
Yes, so every pope since Pius X reissued some sort of reaffirmation of Tra le Sollecitudini. So whether it's Divini Cultis, for example, or Pius XII wrote 3 wonderful documents, 2 encyclicals on the sacred liturgy and sacred music, and then an instruction on sacred music. So the encyclical on sacred liturgy was Mediator Dei, and then De Musica Sacra et Sacra Liturgia, and the other encyclical is escaping me at the moment. And so his documents are also wonderful. And So we have kind of this very strong tradition codified in Pius X. And then even though it was issued in a motu proprio, which is of his own will and perhaps could be rescinded by a future pope, it really enters into the ordinary magisterium of the church by its reaffirmation by every pope through Pope Francis, including Pope Francis, and is no longer just, the whim of Pius X. It's really part of the ordinary magisterium of the church in that way.
And should Gregorian chant be sung in Latin, or could it be sung to a vernacular translation?
This is a good question. So Gregorian chant, properly speaking, is Latin. We might compose things, and Vatican II, especially Musicum Sacram, envisioned that composers would take up the challenge of setting in an appropriate musical style. And as we discussed, chant is an appropriate musical style, the vernacular languages for the sacred liturgy. They were never designed to totally replace the Latin Gregorian chant, but the church does foresee the composers can, using their creativity and being steeped in the Gregorian tradition, create new things that are well suited to the sacred liturgy. And indeed, my colleague here at St. Patrick's Seminary, Father Samuel Weber, has done that very admirably. His English language chant style compositions are really wonderful. They're beautiful. They are lovely to sing. He does a great job of bringing elements of the Gregorian compositions into the vernacular, whether it's little melodic licks, or just the integration of those melodic licks with the accentuation patterns in English. His music is really wonderful. And I, for example, have been part of a project working to adapt the Gregorian Introit, Offertory, and Communion to Spanish. Another of my colleagues, Janet Gorbitz, has done a similar project, but hers is complete. Mine is not complete. And I think that this is an important way of helping people have contact with that innately Catholic style of music and helping them really pray the liturgy and not miss out on a real richness of the church's appointment of texts for the different parts of the Mass by setting them in the vernacular. I think it's an admirable thing to do, and it's also a way of, a lot of these vernacular language chants are simpler in style, and so it's a way of helping people who have perhaps lost contact with the chant tradition, of helping them sing something like that on the way to Gregorian chant. That's perhaps a little bit easier, and that they can sing beautifully. Anything that we sing for the Mass must be done beautifully. And, of course, we all have different skill levels. So it's important to sing something which we can sing beautifully.
Well, that brings us to the next question, which is, do you have any further advice for priests or lay people who would like to introduce Gregorian chant into their parish?
Yeah, I think those vernacular chants of the Mass proper are a good part of that, but I don't think it's actually the first step that I would advise a parish to do. A little story from my background: I was a music director at a parish in West Little Havana in Miami, and we had the choir was up front, and there was an exit to the parking lot next to the choir, and I had a really lovely choir of women. We had I think about 10 or 12 ladies in that group, including 8 or 9 sisters, and then a couple of lay women. And we would sing all of the Mass ordinary chants, the Kyrie, Gloria, etc., in Gregorian, and we would sing the Mass proper as well, along with some hymns. And during the final hymn at Mass, people were headed out to the parking lot, and they would stop by us while we were singing still the final hymn and say, "Oh, thank you so much. That was really beautiful." And of course, it drove me crazy because final hymns are for singing by the congregation. That's why they exist. And so one day I said to my priest, I don't think we should do a final hymn anymore. Can we try something new? And what I proposed to him was that at the end of Mass, he would exit the sanctuary and face the statue of Our Lady, and we would sing the seasonal Marian antiphon. So, of course, during Advent and Christmas, that's Alma Redemptoris Mater. During Lent, or actually from February 2nd through all of Lent, it's Ave Regina Caelorum. During the Eastertide through Pentecost, Regina Caeli. And then the rest of time is Salve Regina. And then following the common singing of that seasonal Marian antiphon, we'll just have the organ play as you process out. And it worked like a charm. People stayed and they happened to already know the seasonal Marian antiphons. I was surprised. I thought they might only know Salve Regina. But they knew all of them, except for Ave Regina Caelorum. We did have to teach that one a little bit. And then people would stay and watch Father process out and then head to the parking lot. And it helped maintain an atmosphere of prayer and encouraged congregational singing at the end of Mass. It worked like a charm. So I would say that's a great place to start. The seasonal Marian antiphons, there are only 4 of them, and people will memorize them quickly. And memorizing means that people sing them by heart, which helps them love them more. And they feel like they can sing it very well and enter into it something that they know. And that's really important for Catholics, to sing something they know. Beyond that, I would say introduce the Mass Ordinary in Latin. You know, a lot of times people think firstly of the Mass that's called Missa Jubilate Deo, proposed by Paul VI in his little book, Jubilate Deo, issued in 1974. And so we think of Kyrie eleison from Mass 16, and then there's the Sanctus, Sanctus, and the accompanying Agnus Dei from Mass 18, the Gloria from Missa de Angelis and Creed 3. That's kind of what Pope Paul VI proposed as chants that every Catholic should know. Those are a great place to start, but I wouldn't actually stay there too long. Those chants, which echo in the Missal Romano and the Roman Missal setting of vernacular settings of those chants, are a great place to start, but they can get a little bit boring or less exciting perhaps for people. And so I would move quickly into teaching them a second Mass Ordinary, perhaps Mass 8, which is well loved by congregations, the Missa de Angelis. Mass 11 is also wonderful. That was the first Mass that I sang as a new singer of Gregorian chant. And I love it more today than I did all those decades ago when I first started singing. So those Marian antiphons and the Mass Ordinary are helpful because they are something that is repeated, that you can repeat a particular Mass Ordinary for a whole season, and people can feel like they really know it, which I think is key in helping people learn to love their own musical tradition of the Gregorian chant.
And was your own interest in Gregorian chant prompted by your work as a church music director, or did it arise independently?
Yeah, I don't know. The precise answer to that framing of the question, I grew up actually just playing the piano and guitar at Mass, and actually the first instrument I ever played at Mass was a synthesizer in the folk group, and I really had a strong anchor in my faith through those experiences. But in my first semester of graduate school, I took a course called Music and the Church, taught by a wonderful scholar who's recently passed away, Quentin Faulkner. And in that class, I read for the first time the documents of the Second Vatican Council, and I thought, oh boy, this doesn't say what I thought it would say about sacred music. I have a lot to learn. And Dr. Faulkner helped me ask a lot of questions that I needed to ask about the church's praxis. And in that process, I remember one day he took me into the library. He said, I think that there's something you should read. And he took me into the periodical stacks in our library at the university. And he showed me an issue of Sacred Music, which is a journal which I have helped edit now for the last 10 years, the Journal of the Church Music Association of America. And it was a sort of vocational moment. I didn't know much of anything at that point, but I knew when I saw that journal that that's what I was supposed to do with my whole life. And that meant that I had a lot to learn. And it was something that was an intellectual process, but also it took me a lot of time to reflect on what is this intellectual formation I'm going through, seemingly by the prompting of the church telling me that Gregorian chant has principal place in the liturgy. What spiritual effects does that have? And in reflecting on those things, I saw so many good spiritual fruits that I knew that I wanted to share that with other people. Because for me, it was a sense of the givenness of the sacred liturgy, that the church is like a mother who teaches us how to pray. And how does she do that? She gives us the sacred liturgy. And it's no longer me swimming and searching my own way and lost in my own druthers and preferences, but instead I can enter into an experience which shapes me and gives me a sense of rootedness throughout history, a cosmic rootedness with all the saints and angels, and a sense of being formed in something that is so strong that it gives me a really strong identity as a Catholic. And that identification and identity that comes in a liturgical spirituality is intensely freeing. I'm no longer subject just to how I feel being the impulse for my prayer, but instead I can allow the church to put words and melodies upon my lips, which I did not choose, so as to follow what Scripture says, that we do not know how to pray as we ought, yet the Spirit prompts us. That's a way of the Spirit prompting us in thinking and praying with the church in the sacred liturgy. And for me, the sacred music is key in all of that.
And are there any recordings of Gregorian chant which you would recommend for people who want to listen to it and learn it that way?
Oh, there's so many. I think the mid to earlier decades of the 20th century recordings by Dom Gajard at Solem are, while they're not ideal in many of aspects of vocal technique, are so incredibly beautiful in the flight of the Gregorian melody that the singing of the monks gives to them. I very, very, very much love those recordings. I also think about the recordings. I think they're probably from the early aughts or maybe the late 90s, of Mary Berry and the Cambridge Schola Gregoriana. It's a quite different style from the Gajard recordings, but also highly emblematic of the pristine beauty of Gregorian chant. And perhaps more recently, there's a recording of Marian chants by the monks that I work with in Norcia. I think that recording came out about 2014, or maybe it was more recent than that. But that's also a very lovely recording, arranged with a particular attention to liturgical structure and with some quite unique chants in there that I would recommend to listeners.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.